And welcome to Leave Us Alone, the podcast that champions individual freedom and limited government. I'm your host, Grover Norquist, and today we're diving into the big, beautiful tax cut bill. And it's coming out, and we can see it now. It's emerging. It's not quite completely born, but it's getting there. And we can talk about the bits that are going to make it and what might not. Here with Mike and James. So who wants to start talking about the list of fun things in this tax bill?
Sure. So as you mentioned, we now have the introduced tax bill. It has already cleared Ways and Means Committee. They're set to, as early as tomorrow, begin marking this up in the Budget Committee, where they stitch all the different work of the committees together, essentially the tax cuts, and then the other committees that are doing work at spending cuts to further the tax cuts. But we now know at least the first draft of what the House has here, of what is in the bill. So I think first off, we can start talking about what damaging things that were floated that aren't in the bill. The key one there is...
Are you going to start with the uncheerful stuff? Or?
Yeah, we'll start with it's cheerful that it's not in there.
Okay, that counts.
So one of these things would be there is no increase in the top individual income tax rate that would have hit millions of small businesses. This idea had been floated. The president came out, shut it down once again last week.
Well, I'm disappointed because Kamala Harris had called for this during the campaign. And it was, I thought, very bipartisan of a handful of Republicans to say, I know Trump won the election and he was against a higher rate. He said that was ridiculous and stupid and wasn't for it. But why don't we do that just to show what good sports we are? I'm glad to see that.
He said it would destroy what they built in his first term, was his exact words.
Yes, and yet we still had a couple of Republican congressmen and senators, they're senators singular maybe, congressmen going, that's an interesting idea.
So this is not in the bill. It protects all of the 2017 Trump tax cut individual rates, makes them permanent with an increased boost, I think essentially accounting for Biden inflation during the Joe Biden administration of a one-time boost in the first year. That gives, in year one, a tax cut for all income brackets.
The other dumb idea that was out and about, because look, if you're trying to fit something into this bill and you can find a offset, meaning a tax increase on somebody else, maybe you could get your tax cut in and pay, and at somebody else's expense. There was an effort to reduce or eliminate state and local tax deductibility of taxes for state and local taxes for corporations, not just the one that we discuss on individuals. That would have, in effect, increased the corporate rate by 2% and put us over China's tax rate. When we were competing with China, we would have a higher tax rate than they would, so we could compete on lower wages rather than on lower taxes. That idea, people really thought that was going to maybe go somewhere because you could do just a little of it and make it look like it wasn't too much to start with. But then as soon as you started with a little of it, it could grow to be quite something unpleasant. That also is off the table and hasn't tried to struggle back onto the table in the same way that the Kamala Harris tax increase has.
And I think that's the good news here is, one, starting off from a perspective of do no harm, pretty much across the board. Any of the tax increase ideas that we saw floated by the media over the last several months, not in this bill. So there's no tax increase on business salt. There's no individual top rate hike that would have hit small businesses across the country.
We may be overreacting. It may just be that the press finds this endlessly fascinating, that they can get one or two Republicans to say something stupid on TV and then just drill into it and make it turn into a movement. And each time it turned out to really be one or two people and not something that had broad-based support. We were talking earlier on all the talk radio shows, the conservative talk radio shows, they were completely dismissive of these ideas to put tax increases in. And the idea that there's some new modern conservative movement that was going to be based on tax increases is kind of a joke. And you see that it didn't show up with congressmen. There weren't a bunch of congressmen saying this is a good idea, or senators. It didn't show up with influencers, talk radio shows, podcasters. There's none of that. It really didn't have a base of support other than in the liberal press.
And I think what you have here is a tax bill that you're seeing across the board from the right support for, especially from free market groups like Americans for Tax Reform, Club for Growth, Americans for Prosperity, all out in support of this bill. And I think we can start running through some of the good things that are in this bill now.
Yes.
So we talked about the damage not done. here's some of the good things. James, did you want to hop in?
Well, I just wanted to say that one of the few votes of support for a higher top income tax bracket came from American Compass, and apparently this is their magazine called Commonplace, which I didn't realize. Last night when we were reading this, they subtweeted you, Grover. They said, to understand why today's Republican Party isn't the party of Grover Norquist worship, no you're not tagged in it, and how GOP electeds should respond, read the full piece here, where they argue that it's not that unpopular among Republicans to raise the top income tax bracket. And they argue this by citing American Compass's own polling that they paid for, showing that 43% of Republicans would be okay with a top income tax bracket. And that number goes up to 48% among working class Republicans. Meaning no matter what, a majority of Republicans are still against this, even by their polling that they paid for. And clearly they meant to publish this like 2 weeks ago, but it only came out last night after this debate was over.
And you can be pretty sure that the way they asked the question kind of fudges it, because we've seen polling data going back when we were fighting with Obama, and they would say, well, would you be for this if a higher tax on individuals or businesses was used to reduce the deficit? Well, yes, then I'd be for it. Do you believe if they raise that tax, it would be used to fight the deficit? No. I mean, overwhelmingly, people said, yeah, I'd be for it if it was going to do that, but then asked, do you think that is what would happen? They go, oh, no, of course that's not what would happen. At which point, which side of that debate is the speaker actually on? He says, you asked if it was used for deficit stuff, what would I think? I think maybe you could do that. Do I think for a moment it would? Because it never has been? No, I don't think it would be.
And I guess it's nice too when Team Tax Hike is a week late getting to the fight, publishing an op-ed that should have been out the week before, and going around with 2024 polling makes our job easier, I guess.
Yeah, and even with a leading question, can't get to majority support within the party, so.
Okay, so let's get back to running through what we have in the bill here. We mentioned earlier we have permanency for the individual tax cuts in the bill for the brackets. The 2017 Trump level brackets will continue. They won't expire. They will be made permanent. Next, we have a permanency of the doubled standard deduction claimed by about 90% of taxpayers, and with a 4-year increase of $2,000.
And that means 90% of Americans don't have to keep all their receipts, or every time they made a contribution to church or to the local charity or something, you don't have to prove that because the standard deduction is so high, you don't hit it.
And this is one of those points where I'm sure people remember nearly every Republican elected official in the past ran on, we're going to make it so simple to file your taxes. You can do it on a postcard. We've pretty much achieved that now.
For 90% of people.
Yeah, where I think, for most folks, it's taken them about an hour to do their taxes. They're doing it online for the most part now, not on a postcard. But great tax simplification. Before the Trump tax cuts, about 1/3 of all tax filers had to itemize. Now it's over 90% taking the standard deduction.
Progress.
We also have an expanded child tax credit. The $2,000 child tax credit is permanently extended with an additional 4-year boost of $500 per child. I think this is the kind of pro-family section of the bill where you have, I think, a key part here too is no increased refundability, Grover, which we've talked about before. Whenever you hear that's the portion of a tax credit in which you go past someone's $0 tax liability and now you're just spending. There's no increase in that. I think that's a great win.
A refundable tax credit is spending. The government's just writing you a check. It's not coming from the Department of Energy. It's coming from the IRS, but it's a government check, and it is spending. It's not a tax cut. If you owe the government $2 and they say, no, we're going to cut it down to $1, that's a tax cut. If they say we're going to give you a $10 check, that's a check. That's spending. That's spending. It's not a tax cut.
So this is fiscally responsible pro-family policy.
Yes.
We have a small business tax cut here. This is a lot of focus on this bill has been on the pass-through deduction, Section 199A. They were increased this from 20% to 23% for the deduction, essentially meaning any individually owned business can deduct 23% now, up from 20% of their qualified business income, a massive pro-growth tax cut for small businesses. We also have death tax relief, Grover, where they've raised the exemption levels to $15 million for an individual, I believe 30 for a
couple.
Yeah, for a couple. And indexed to inflation, made permanent. We also have.
We ought to get rid of it, but to the extent that we can protect more and more people each time we do this, we are on a march towards where we do not tax. Look, when you earn $1, you pay taxes on it. If you save it, you pay taxes on that. If you invest it, you pay taxes on that. If you have a capital gains, you pay taxes on that. And then if you're stupid enough to die, they want to take up to half. It's that last part that we really need to start getting rid of, as well as the double taxation of savings and investment, period.
So next we have kind of what are the most pro-growth provisions of the bill. These are on the business side, the cost recovery expensing provisions. So 100% expensing through 2029, a 5-year extension. And Grover, you've always sold this point of how it needs to be made retroactive to start in 2025. So businesses right now, we're not having that situation of delayed growth that we saw in 2017. The mistake we've talked about that Republicans made was we didn't have that bill pass until the end of 2017. The economy didn't really start feeling the impact of the policy of the tax cuts until 2019.
President Trump has made it clear that he would like everything to go back to January 20th when he became president. I kind of like January 1st, since that's what the taxable year. Maybe that's negotiable as we move forward. But taking it back to January 20th or January 1st is an important way of saying, go ahead and make your investments now. You don't have to worry that if we don't pass it for 2 or 3 months, that somehow you won't get the expensing.
So we revive here. It's the 100% expensing. We have expensing for research and development. Grover, we also have some of the most pro-growth parts of the 2017 Trump tax cuts renewed here in this bill. These are the cost recovery provisions for businesses. This is 100% expensing for research and development, proper treatment of interest deductibility. And in addition to this, we have new expensing for structures, for manufacturing, for agriculture, and for energy development. These are all major pro-growth provisions where the idea is instead of making companies spread out their costs if they invest in a new, say, facility, rather than over a number of years, they can expense this in year one, immediately deductible from their taxes.
That reduces the cost of capital, which allows people to have more capital per worker, which gives you more productive workers, which gives you higher pay. This is huge.
And these are the provisions that were already expiring from TCJ. So 100% expensing, for example, was phasing out from 100% to 40% down to 20% and set to expire. So these are the provisions that we were already feeling the economy worsen because of the expiration of these provisions. Now they're brought back at 100%.
Much of this tax cut is simply we're continuing good policy. These 3 things, 4th thing with expensing for new factories, this is new and additional.
And that's why it's so huge and important. Yeah. So in addition to these provisions, we have some of the items from the president's campaign.
No tax
trail,
on tips.
Like no tax on tips. And I think there's a huge thing to point out here, too, because to our frustration, when the talk of tax-free tips at the time, you had these reporters and you had some of these fake budget hawk groups walking around saying, no tax on tips was going to be $1 trillion. It was going to be $500 billion. Now we have it. No tax for tips for 4 years, coming in at $34 billion, dramatically lower than what the media ran around crying about during the campaign cycle. I think the way they've done it is really interesting. It's essentially creating a new deduction for tipped income. Again, coming in much more fiscally responsible than the media claimed during the campaign trail.
Yeah, and they also were going around saying that like lawyers were going to have $0 salaries and take everything as a tip, which it totally ignores the fact that there is a very long history of tipped employment in the United States, a long history of taxing it, and almost every state, and there is a federal definition of what is traditionally tipped employment. I mean, several states have different minimum wages for tipped workers. So like there are clear legal definitions that already exist that you can work with.
And one of those definitions that they borrow is they essentially put an income cap on this. So any talk about this was going to be used so hedge fund owners can now claim tipped income is ridiculous. It's limited to traditionally tipped professions. There's they use the definition of a highly compensated employee, which is no one over $160,000 can claim for 2026.
There's a reason why the left jumped in to try and kill this with the exaggerations you're talking about. And that is because while this is a tax issue for the men and women who work for Uber or Lyft or for restaurants or who paint your nails and cut your hair, the left sees this as a union issue. They don't think they can unionize people if everybody's paid based on how well they work and how hard they work and how much they do a good job because they get paid additional by customers saying, thank you very much. I really appreciate everything you did for me. Unions only work if you treat everybody as if they're automatons and they're all the same and there is no difference and everybody works the same in the same hour, which is nonsense. We know always nonsense, but it's particularly nonsense in tipped industries. And the unions try and kill this. You'll see this in many states. People listening may remember this in some of the cities near them where the unions are trying to kill tipped income in cities. Why? On behalf of the unions, so you can unionize the restaurants and the other facilities where you have tipped.
And another thing they did well with tax-free tips, and this is something ATR worked on, was ensuring that tax-free tips would apply to independent contractors. Because we didn't want to create the situation in which you would have employees only receiving tipped income while you have, pretty much every Uber or Lyft driver, for example, in the country who's an independent contractor. It doesn't apply to them. So you could have created this situation where you see California AB5 style bills that end the right to work, this massive new incentive for union bosses to go around with the incentive of saying, hey, if you go from being your own boss as an independent contractor to being a unionized employee, now you'll have tax-free tips because only employees do. We have that fix in here.
Good.
Tax-free tips applies to independent contractors as well, and that's
And
huge.
this is the one Ted Cruz was working on, right?
Correct. And this was the focus of, I think, great work here from the Ways and Means Committee under Jason Smith, too.
Yes.
And if you would like to be pro-growth in terms of helping this podcast grow, just remember to rate and review if you are enjoying Leave Us Alone on your favorite podcast platform. Your support helps us reach more listeners who care about these important issues. And don't forget to share this episode with your friends and family. That is our version of a tax-free tip. Now, back to the conversation.
So a couple other good, these are some more fun items in the bill that we like to highlight. And of course, this is a non-exhausted list. We have the full list of tax cuts in the bill at atr.org. Everyone should go and check that out.
I sent this to the Ways and Means Committee people, and I got a couple nice notes back saying this was the clearest explanation of what was in front of them. They really appreciated it. So this has been debruced for purposes of looking at gobbledygook.
One thing we've learned from the ATR comp department is that people love lists. Lists are always very popular here at ATR.
atr.org/list.
So one of the great things on our list here is, for a long time, we've been banging the drum on this, but we have repeal of Biden's 1099-K,
Yes.
Venmo, PayPal reporting requirements. This is going to be a nightmare of paperwork for taxpayers. What the Biden administration did in the misnamed American Rescue Plan Act, this was their fake COVID spending bill, where they spent $1.9 trillion. I believe the only provision in that bill that raised new revenue from taxpayers, they decided to go after you in a COVID bill here, was to lower your reporting requirements to the IRS for your 1099-K, which, this is pretty much if you use a Venmo or a PayPal account, for example, to $600, down from $20,000, and you had to have 200 transactions, basically be operating like a business, to just anyone with over $600 in transactions. They then were aware of what the political blowback to this would be, so they delayed implementing it every year, and then, of course, left the Trump administration with a ticking time bomb of this was going to start kicking in this tax year. So this bill fully repeals that, restores the original pre-Biden reporting thresholds. So these stories about the IRS coming after your Venmo and PayPal put to rest in this bill.
Well, there was a true story that it was going to happen. We're going to stop it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That is important and helpful. No tax on car loan interest. And, finally, we're repealing the federal excise tax on indoor tanning.
This is one of the Obamacare taxes.
Yes,
So
I thought we killed this a long time ago. What happened?
No, and this is, we've been counting here at ATR, this is the 7th Obamacare tax that we have been able to repeal. But these are very shocking to people, where the Obama administration is just going after any revenue they could find for Obamacare. But repealing the indoor tanning tax. Another fun one we have here is the elimination of the $200 tax on silencers, on firearms.
This is important.
Yeah, can I ask a question? So why just a tax repeal? Why aren't they taking silencers off of the National Firearms Registry?
You have been on Twitter, young man. Okay, on Twitter, people are going, it's a great idea that we're getting rid of the $200 tax per silencer, or what's the other word for it?
A suppressor.
Suppressors.
So the legal term, because I've had friends yell at me over this, that you're not supposed to say a silencer, it's supposed to be suppressor. In law, it is a silencer.
Okay. It doesn't make it silent. It just means it's not going to hurt your hearing. I served on the board of directors of the NRA for 18 years, and half of the folks on the board were very hard of hearing from lots and lots of shooting. There's no reason if you're shooting, for hunting, or you're shooting for sport and you're trying to, you have to shoot an awful lot to see how accurate you can be. Why in the world would you do that when it's so loud in your ear? You don't need that. So yes, silencers.
Yeah, this is a follow-on because I saw one Arnold Ventures person on Twitter tweet this out and then quickly delete it from the feedback. But they put out, can someone please tell me what the good reason for someone having a silencer for a gun is? And it's like anyone with neighbors. How about that?
Neighbors or ears that they're right next to your gun when you're shooting, for crying out loud. But here's this, everything we've been talking about here is the reconciliation package, the ability to pass a law that reduces spending and reduces taxes, but it cannot change laws, okay? That's why we couldn't abolish Obamacare, but we could cut the taxes on Obamacare through reconciliation. With this, we can get rid of the $200 transfer tax on silencers, but we can't change the rules on how they're registered and so on. That takes 60 votes in the Senate. I'm for that. All the good people in the world are for that, but you can't do it on this bill. And there's been some misrepresentation / truly dishonest criticism of the Republicans. Why didn't they do X? Well, they should have checked. They would have known why you can't do X.
Yeah, it's a reminder we can't solve all of the world's ills in reconciliation, but you can do something as you can zero out a tax even if you're not able to completely eliminate its existence in statute itself.
If they're not making any money, we can come back and get rid of the other thing later.
And credit to David Kustoff, Congressman of Tennessee.
What a hero.
This is his legislative effort.
And he's getting yelled at because he didn't do things that weren't legal.
So speaking of what is and is not possible in reconciliation, we ready to move on to the energy and commerce portion of the bill?
Please.
So, believe it or not, Ways and Means did not have the longest markup this week for their portion
Really?
of the bill. Energy and Commerce went for a genuine marathon of 26.5 hours. So,
are you allowed to pee and stuff or not?
yes,
okay.
you're allowed to leave the room. And although when I once testified before one of their subcommittees, the witnesses, we really weren't allowed to leave the room. And I've never been in more trying to. But anyway.
It's not like a filibuster. You can.
No, you can leave the room. But there was a lot of Celsius being drunk on camera. A lot of kava being delivered. There's a nice little story in the Hill about this that I encourage folks to go read. But not before you read the blog on digitalliberty.net. That is the affiliate that I run, where we've written about the two key provisions of the Energy and Commerce Bill that have to do with technology. And that is spectrum and AI. So starting with AI, we have been beating the drum the last few months that Congress needs to pass a federal preemption of state regulations of AI. There are over 1,000 bills right now pending before state legislatures. Some of them not so bad, but a lot of them would really they would impose liability on developers for how other people use their technology, which is ridiculous. That's not how we handle liability in any other field. It would create a patchwork of state laws if a bunch of these passed that it would be impossible for people to comply with. This is clearly interstate commerce and something that the federal government needs to pass some sort of moratorium on. Much like the Internet Tax Freedom Act that you, Grover, were very important in.
That was very important.
And that was an effort 20 years ago to make sure that the internet access was not taxed. And eventually, after being renewed every few years for about 2 decades, it was finally made permanent. That was probably 2012, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
It's been a while.
Yeah. But anyway, a similar policy is needed on the AI front, and rather surprisingly, pleasantly surprisingly, it was included in the Energy and Commerce Bill. So there is a federal preemption. There's a $500 million appropriation for updating government systems that scores as an expense. But in the long term, that saves a lot of money because there are a lot of these government computers that are operating off of cobalt. As Doge has been exposing, you have to take an elevator down a mine shaft to retire somebody from the federal workforce because there's this limestone mine in Pennsylvania full of records.
Is that where they put retirees?
No, that's where they put their records. You have to go, because if you just put retirees in there, you would have to go down once. You have to go down this long shaft and then all the way back up with the paperwork in order to retire them. So it wouldn't take nearly long enough if you could just send them down. But there are many of these systems. Our friends at Citizens Against Government Waste have been working on this for a long time. Yeah, and they've been talking about how this scores as an expense in a 10-year budget window, but in the long run, it makes permanent cost savings that will more than make up for the $500 million they're trying to spend.
Why did they never do that before?
because of course is an expense in reconciliation. So that's the first part, is to adopt AI systems for the government, so you can retire a lot of these people who don't really do anything that work for the federal government and don't have to pay for their benefits anymore. It reduces the number of government workers in their unions. All of this is good, but they also have this federal preemption for state and local regulation. Now, as we're saying with the suppressors, it is quite possible this will not actually pass the Senate's bird bath, is what it's known. It's named after noted Klansman, Democrat Senator Robert Byrd, who was responsible for the Budget Act of 1974 that created the reconciliation process. So the House can basically do whatever it wants, but it's the Senate where you're trying to get past the filibuster where the Byrd rule applies. And that's what says it can only affect spending and taxation, only revenue and expense, no policy changes. And so once the bill is written and it goes to the floor, they have what's called the bird bath, where a bunch of provisions will wash out because the Senate parliamentarian will rule that they are not simply expense or revenue. They have a policy change that is more than incidental to the policy. So that's the key word, is if it is incidental to spending and taxation, then it can remain in. So I'm not super confident or optimistic that this will remain in the final bill when it is signed into law. However, getting every Republican in the House on record voting for this, getting senators on record supporting it before the bird bath, is a great idea, and it will help build support in the long run. The other thing I want to quickly mention, we've talked about repeatedly, is spectrum auctions. This bill makes 600 megahertz of spectrum that is currently under federal or shared federal and non-federal use available for auctions. It's projected to bring in $88 billion by CBO. CBO always cuts their projection in half, so it's probably twice that. And that's going to be
And James, if they're
growth.
not selling this, what's the government doing with the spectrum?
No, they're sitting on it and they're using it rather inefficiently for various purposes. Most of it belongs to DoD. And if you ask them what exactly are you using the spectrum for, they'll tell you that's classified. So this is why you need the president on your side if you really want to do a spectrum auction, because the White House has directed the Pentagon, no, you're going to come to the table, you're going to find efficiencies, and they've come up with 600 megahertz of spectrum in basically mid-band spectrum. It's powerful stuff. It's good for mobile technology. It's good for wireless development. It's good for 5G. So we'll see that go to
Like
market.
your phones?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Sorry, it's for cell phone technology. So we're going to see that go to market, and they have to sell at least 200 megahertz within 3 years and the rest within 6 years. So it's not going to be as long a wait as we were expecting. And that's all going to be great for innovation and growth.
And we've previously run through a lot of the Medicaid reform that's going on from Energy and Commerce Committee. We'll detail that more in a future podcast, but we talked about how Energy and Commerce really did have one of the most difficult jobs. I think Chairman Guthrie came through pretty great here. I think they were tasked with finding $880 billion of deficit reduction. I believe they came in above that, correct?
I believe so. I don't remember what the exact number is at the end, but they more than fulfilled their mandate. I want to give a couple.
There might have been an updated number since that. I think they came in a little over $910 billion.
Yeah, so we're talking almost $1 trillion.
Above target.
Yeah, that's incredible. And we need to give, I think, specific shout outs to a couple of members. I mean, all of them had to sit there for 26 hours, and there was only a break for dinner. Like, they didn't sleep. This was overnight. It was really incredible. But especially Richard Hudson, member from North Carolina, who's the chair of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, gave a great defense of the Medicaid provisions, dispelled some of the lies that were coming from the other side of the aisle, which was genuinely hysterical shouting and waving around pictures of people who were never going to be losing their Medicaid coverage. And further, we also need to give a shout out to Dan Crenshaw, a member from Texas, who gave a very eloquent defense of work requirements and really a philosophical explanation of the dignity of work and how it has value to society and why that is better than being on welfare your whole life and how that robs you of your agency as a human being, and that their job in Congress is not to keep you dependent, but to help you restore your dignity and agency as a human being. And I would commend to everybody, look up that clip. It's really great. But first, go to Digital Liberty and read our blog about the provisions in the technology bill.
Absolutely. Okay, so guys, we have been wrapping up today's episode now of Leave Us Alone, and I want to thank you all for joining us. We hope you found the discussion as enlightening as we did, and if you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and to review us on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us to reach more listeners who care about these important issues, and don't forget to share this episode with your friends, family, anyone else who values their liberty. So stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll continue to bring you thought-provoking conversations and insights. Until then, I'm Grover Norquist, reminding you to cherish your freedom, and keep pushing for a government that leaves us alone.